Motivation got you excited on January 1st. By January 19th it was gone, and you blamed yourself for it. Here's what nobody told you. It was never going to last. Not because you're weak, not because you lack willpower, but because motivation was never designed to be a reliable foundation for anything in the first place. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why motivation fails everyone, without exception, and exactly what actually separates people who follow through from people who don't. It has almost nothing to do with how motivated either of them feels. Let's start with the truth. Motivation is an emotion. It rises and falls based on factors mostly outside your control: sleep, stress, dopamine, how interesting or novel something currently feels to your brain. Expecting motivation to stay consistently high enough to carry you through months or years of difficult, repetitive work is like expecting to stay hungry the entire time you're cooking a meal. The feeling that got you started was never built to last the whole way through. This is not a personal failure. This is simply how emotions work. And it applies to literally everyone, including the most successful, disciplined people you admire. They are not more motivated than you, most of the time. They have simply stopped depending on motivation to get things done. Let's talk about why motivation feels so convincing at the start, because understanding this trap is the first step to escaping it. When you first decide to change something, start a new habit, pursue a new goal, commit to a new routine, your brain releases a surge of dopamine tied to the novelty and possibility of the new plan. This is genuinely enjoyable, and it feels like proof that this time will be different, that you've finally found the motivation to follow through permanently. But dopamine tied to novelty fades. Reliably, predictably, usually within days or a couple of weeks. This isn't a sign anything went wrong. It's simply how the brain's reward system works. The excitement of a new plan is not the same thing as the capacity to sustain that plan once the initial excitement inevitably fades. Let's talk about what actually replaces motivation in people who consistently follow through over the long term. The answer isn't more motivation or better motivation or some secret trick to keep the initial excitement burning indefinitely. The answer is systems, and specifically discipline, built on structure rather than feeling. People who consistently follow through have simply removed the requirement that they feel motivated in order to act. They've built systems that function regardless of how they feel on any given day. Let's talk about the specific difference between motivation and discipline, because conflating these two concepts is where most people get stuck. Motivation is the desire to do something. Discipline is doing it regardless of whether you currently desire to. These are fundamentally different mechanisms, and building your life around the first one, waiting to feel motivated before you act, means your consistency will always be at the mercy of your mood, your energy level, and whatever else happens to be competing for your attention that day. Discipline removes this dependency entirely. A disciplined person doesn't ask, do I feel like doing this today? They ask, Ryle, is this what I committed to doing? And then they do it, regardless of the answer to the first question. This isn't about suppressing emotion or pretending you feel something. You don't. It's about recognizing that feeling. And action don't actually need to be connected the way most people assume they do. Let's talk about why this distinction matters so much. Practically, in daily life, if you wait for motivation before exercising, you will exercise inconsistently. Since motivation to exercise fluctuates constantly, often lowest exactly when you need the exercise most, during stress, fatigue, or difficult periods. If you build a system, a specific time, a specific commitment that doesn't require checking in with your motivation first, you exercise consistently, regardless of how you feel that particular day. This same pattern applies to virtually every area of meaningful long-term effort. Building a business, learning a skill, maintaining a relationship, improving your health. None of these are sustained by motivation alone, because motivation was never built to sustain anything over the time frames these goals actually require. Let's talk about the specific psychological mechanism that makes discipline more reliable than motivation, because understanding the actual mechanism makes it far easier to build. Discipline is fundamentally about reducing the number of decisions required to take action. When an action depends on motivation, you're making a fresh decision every single time. Do I feel like doing this right now? Weighing the effort against your current mood and competing priorities. This decision-making process is exhausting, and it's exactly where most people's consistency breaks down. Not because the task itself is too hard, but because the constant decision of whether to do it drains willpower that could otherwise go towards simply doing it. Discipline, built through consistent systems and routines, removes this decision entirely. The action becomes automatic, tied to a specific time, place, or trigger, rather than tied to how you currently feel. This is why people with strong routines often describe their habits as requiring less willpower over time, not more, once the habit becomes automatic rather than a fresh decision made daily. Let's talk about the ancient roots of this idea, because like calm and accurate perspective, discipline over motivation is far from a modern productivity trend. The Stoics placed enormous emphasis on action independent of feeling. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the importance of simply doing what needs to be done, regardless of whether he felt like doing it, understanding that waiting for the right feeling before acting was both unreliable and, ultimately, unnecessary. Duty, discipline, and consistent action were treated as separate from and more reliable than the fluctuating tide of daily emotion. This wisdom held up for thousands of years, not because ancient philosophers were somehow immune to lacking motivation, but because they understood something modern productivity culture often forgets. Waiting to feel ready is optional. Acting despite not feeling ready is a choice available to everyone at any time, regardless of current emotional state. Let's talk about how motivation actually works against you, specifically when you rely on it too heavily. The first way, motivation creates an all-or-nothing trap. When you're highly motivated, you tend to commit to ambitious, sweeping plans, a complete diet overhaul, a 2-hour daily workout routine, an entirely restructured schedule. These plans feel achievable in the moment of high motivation, but they're often unsustainable once that initial motivation fades, which it inevitably will. This creates a pattern of ambitious starts followed by complete abandonment, rather than steady, sustainable progress. The second way, motivation makes you dependent on external circumstances staying favorable. If your consistency depends on feeling motivated, then stress, poor sleep, a bad day, or simply life getting complicated all become legitimate reasons to skip whatever you'd committed to. Since difficult circumstances are inevitable, relying on motivation means your consistency will inevitably break down exactly when circumstances get hard, which is often precisely when consistency matters most. The third way, motivation creates a false narrative about who succeeds and who doesn't. If you believe successful, disciplined people are simply more motivated than you, you'll interpret your own lack of motivation as evidence of some fundamental inadequacy, rather than recognizing it as a completely normal, universal experience that has very little to do with actual long-term success. This false narrative often leads to unnecessary shame and self-criticism, over something that was never actually the determining factor to begin with. Let's talk about what actually determines whether someone follows through on their goals, based on real behavioral patterns rather than the popular myth of motivation as the key ingredient. The first real factor, environmental design. People who consistently follow through on habits and goals typically don't rely on willpower to resist temptation or overcome inertia. Instead, they design their environment to make the desired behavior easier and competing behaviors harder. If you want to exercise consistently, laying out your workout clothes the night before removes a small but real barrier. If you want to reduce phone usage, physically placing your phone in another room removes the temptation entirely, rather than requiring constant willpower to resist checking it. This is a fundamentally different approach than relying on motivation. Environmental design assumes correctly that your willpower and motivation will fluctuate, and builds systems that don't depend on either staying consistently high. The second real factor, starting absurdly small. One of the most consistent findings across behavioral research is that habits which start unreasonably small, smaller than motivation would ever suggest is worthwhile, tend to actually stick while ambitious. Motivation-fueled plans tend to collapse. A 5-minute daily walk is far more likely to become a permanent habit than an ambitious hour-long daily workout plan, precisely because the 5-minute version requires so little from your fluctuating motivation that you can do it even on your worst, least motivated days. Once a small habit becomes automatic, it can be gradually expanded, but the expansion happens from a foundation of consistency, not from an initial burst of high motivation that inevitably fades. The third real factor, identity-based commitment rather than outcome-based motivation. People who successfully build lasting habits often shift their internal narrative from "I'm trying to lose weight," an outcome-focused, motivation-dependent framing, to "I'm someone who exercises consistently," an identity-based framing that doesn't depend on daily motivation to sustain itself. Identity-based commitment tends to survive low motivation days far better than outcome-based motivation, because the action becomes tied to who you understand yourself to be, rather than how you currently feel or how close you currently are to a distant outcome. Let's talk about how to actually build this shift from motivation-dependent action to discipline-based systems. Practically, starting now, the first practice. Stop waiting to feel motivated before starting. The next time you notice yourself waiting for motivation before beginning something you've committed to, recognize this waiting as the actual obstacle, not a legitimate reason to delay. Motivation is not a prerequisite for action. It's often counterintuitively a result of having already started, arriving after momentum has built, not before. The second practice, build systems small enough to survive your worst days. Whatever habit or goal you're building toward, design the minimum version. The version so small it feels almost too easy that you could complete even on a day with zero motivation, poor sleep, high stress, or general low energy. This minimum version becomes your actual commitment, not the ambitious, motivation-fueled version you do on your best days. The third practice, remove decision points wherever possible. Every time an action requires a fresh decision, do I feel like doing this right now? You introduce an opportunity for motivation, or lack of it, to derail your consistency. Design your systems to remove as many of these decision points as possible. Same time each day, same location, clothes laid out in advance, environment arranged so the desired action is the path of least resistance, not something requiring active willpower to choose each time. The fourth practice, track consistency, not motivation or mood. Keep a simple record of whether you followed through on your commitment, regardless of how motivated or unmotivated you felt beforehand. Over time, this record reveals something important. Your actual follow-through rate has very little correlation with how motivated you felt on any given day. This evidence helps dismantle the false belief that motivation is a necessary ingredient for consistent action. The fifth practice: reframe difficulty as expected, not as a sign something is wrong. When a habit or goal feels hard, when motivation is completely absent, when everything in you wants to skip it, recognize this as a completely normal part of the process, not evidence that you've chosen the wrong goal or that something has gone wrong. Discipline is built precisely in these moments, doing the thing despite not feeling like it, not in the easy moments when motivation happens to be naturally high. Let's talk about something important. This isn't about becoming a joyless robot, grinding through everything without any genuine enjoyment or connection to what you're doing. Motivation and enjoyment still matter, and there's real value in choosing goals and habits that genuinely align with things you care about, rather than arbitrary goals imposed purely through willpower. The point isn't to eliminate motivation from the equation entirely. It's to stop depending on motivation as the primary mechanism that determines whether you follow through, since that dependency is precisely what causes most people's efforts to collapse once initial excitement inevitably fades. Let's talk about a way to think about all of this that might help you hold on to it clearly. Imagine motivation as wind and discipline as an engine. A sailboat relying purely on wind moves wonderfully when conditions are favorable, and goes nowhere when the wind dies down, which it inevitably will, unpredictably, and often at the worst possible moments. A boat with an engine can still use favorable wind when it's available, but doesn't depend on it. It keeps moving forward, regardless of whether the wind is currently cooperating. Motivation is wonderful when it's present, and you should absolutely use it when it shows up. But building your entire capacity for consistent action purely on motivation, means you will inevitably stall out repeatedly. Whenever conditions become unfavorable, which they will for everyone eventually, discipline is the engine that keeps you moving forward regardless, and it's the only mechanism that actually accounts for the reality that motivation was never designed to be consistently available. Let's talk about how this reframe specifically changes your relationship with setbacks and inconsistency. If you believe motivation is the key ingredient for success, every low motivation day feels like evidence of failure. A sign that something has gone wrong, that you've somehow lost your drive or commitment. This interpretation often triggers a downward spiral, where a single missed day attributed to low motivation becomes an excuse to abandon the entire effort. Since the "in and motivation is gone" narrative suggests the whole endeavor has failed. If you understand that motivation was never the actual mechanism sustaining your progress, low motivation days become simply expected, unremarkable parts of a longer process, rather than evidence that something has fundamentally broken. You can act despite low motivation, precisely because you never depended on motivation being consistently present in the first place. Let's talk about how this applies specifically to major life goals, not just small daily habits, since the same principle scales significantly. Building a business, writing a book, completing a degree, recovering from a significant setback, all require sustained effort over months or years, far longer than any burst of motivation could reasonably be expected to last. People who successfully complete these kinds of long-term endeavors are not people who somehow maintained high motivation the entire time. They are people who built systems, routines, and identity-based commitment, strong enough to carry them through the inevitable long stretches where motivation was largely or entirely absent. This reframe is genuinely liberating once fully absorbed. You do not need to wait to feel motivated before pursuing something meaningful. You do not need to manufacture constant enthusiasm to sustain long-term effort. You simply need systems robust enough to function without it, and the willingness to act repeatedly, even when the feeling that got you started has long since faded. Let's talk about a specific, common failure pattern this understanding helps explain. The January 1st phenomenon most people have experienced firsthand. Every year, an enormous number of people begin new goals with intense motivation. A new year, a fresh start, an exciting sense of possibility. Within a few weeks, for the vast majority, this motivation fades as it always does, and the goal gets abandoned. Not because the goal was wrong, or because these people are uniquely undisciplined, but because the entire plan was built on a foundation, motivation, that was never designed to last that long in the first place. The people who do successfully maintain New Year's resolutions, or any ambitious new goal long-term, are not the ones who somehow sustained higher motivation than everyone else. They are the ones who, consciously or not, built systems and habits robust enough to survive the inevitable motivation crash that happens to literally everyone, usually within the first few weeks. Let's talk about how to apply this understanding directly to whatever goal or habit you're currently trying to build or sustain. Ask yourself honestly, is my current plan dependent on maintaining a level of motivation I know realistically won't last? If the answer is yes, the plan needs to change. Not because you lack sufficient willpower, but because the plan itself is built on an unreliable foundation. Redesign it around a minimum version, small enough to survive low motivation days, tied to a specific system or routine rather than a feeling you're hoping to sustain indefinitely. Let's talk about the relationship between discipline and self-respect, because this connection matters more than most people realize. Every time you act in alignment with a commitment, despite not feeling motivated to, you build a specific kind of trust with yourself. Evidence, accumulated over time, that your word to yourself actually means something, that you follow through regardless of fluctuating feelings. This self-trust compounds, becoming the foundation for increasingly ambitious commitments, because each one is built on a demonstrated track record of following through, rather than hoping that motivation will somehow be different this time. Conversely, every time you skip a commitment specifically because motivation was absent, you reinforce the opposite pattern, a growing belief that your actions depend entirely on your feelings, and that when feelings aren't cooperative, commitments simply don't get honored. This pattern, repeated enough times, becomes deeply discouraging, not because of any single missed day, but because of what the accumulated pattern quietly teaches you about your own reliability. Let's talk about how to rebuild this self-trust if it's been eroded by years of motivation-dependent starts and stops. The first step: choose one small commitment, deliberately small enough that motivation becomes almost irrelevant to whether you can complete it. Something so minimal, 2 minutes of exercise, 1 sentence of writing, 5 minutes of a new skill, that even your lowest motivation version of yourself could realistically complete it. The goal here isn't the size of the action itself. It's building evidence, repeated and consistent, that you follow through regardless of feeling. The second step: track your consistency explicitly and notice the pattern as it builds. Keep a simple record, a check mark, a note, anything that lets you see plainly how consistently you're following through on this small commitment. Over weeks, this record becomes tangible evidence countering the old narrative that your actions depend entirely on motivation, replacing it with a new, more accurate pattern of reliable follow-through. The third step: gradually expand, but only once the foundation is genuinely solid. Once your small commitment feels fully automatic, requiring little to no willpower to maintain, you can begin expanding it, adding complexity, increasing the time or effort involved. This expansion, built on a solid foundation of demonstrated consistency, tends to hold far better than an ambitious plan built directly on an initial burst of motivation, since the underlying system, not the fluctuating feeling, is what's actually carrying the increased commitment forward. Let's talk about what this shift ultimately means for how you understand yourself and your capacity for meaningful, sustained change. You have likely spent years believing that your inconsistency, your unfinished goals, your abandoned resolutions reflected some personal failing, insufficient discipline, insufficient willpower, insufficient motivation compared to people who seem to achieve more. This belief was never accurate. It was simply a misunderstanding of how consistent action actually works for everyone, including the people you've been comparing yourself to. The people who achieve significant, sustained results are not experiencing constant, unwavering motivation that somehow eludes you. They have simply stopped depending on motivation as the mechanism carrying them forward. This is learnable. It is not a fixed trait some people have and others don't. It is a skill built through deliberate practice, small commitments, and systems designed to function regardless of how you feel on any given day. Let's talk about what to actually do with all of this, practically starting today. First, identify one goal or habit you've been trying to maintain purely through motivation and honestly assess whether the current plan is realistically sustainable once that initial motivation fades, which it inevitably will. Second, redesign that goal around a minimum viable version, small enough to survive your lowest motivation days, rather than the ambitious version motivation initially inspired. Third, remove as many decision points as possible from the habit. Same time, same place, environment arranged to make the action the path of least resistance, rather than something requiring a fresh decision and sufficient motivation each time. Fourth, begin tracking consistency explicitly, building tangible evidence that counters the belief that your actions depend on how motivated you currently feel. Fifth, the next time motivation is completely absent and you're tempted to skip your commitment because of it, do the minimum version anyway. Let this become proof, repeated over time, that you are capable of consistent action independent of fluctuating feeling. Let's talk about something important before we finish. This shift from motivation-dependent action to discipline-based systems is not a single decision that permanently resolves the issue overnight. It's a gradual retraining, built through repeated practice. Small commitments honored consistently, evidence accumulated slowly over weeks and months, not through a single moment of realization that instantly changes everything. There will be days you slip back into old patterns, waiting for motivation, skipping commitments when it doesn't show up. This isn't failure. It's simply part of how deeply ingrained patterns actually shift, gradually, with consistent practice, not through willpower alone in a single moment. Let me leave you with this. Motivation was never going to save you, not because something is wrong with you, but because motivation was never designed to carry anyone through months or years of meaningful, difficult work. Every single person you admire for their discipline, their consistency, their sustained achievement has experienced exactly the same fluctuating, unreliable motivation you have. The difference was never motivation itself. It was the decision to stop depending on it. You do not need to wait to feel ready. You do not need to manufacture constant enthusiasm to sustain meaningful effort. You simply need a system small enough to survive your worst days, and the willingness to honor that system repeatedly, especially on the days motivation is nowhere to be found. This is not about becoming someone who never struggles, never feels resistance, never wants to skip what they've committed to. It's about building the capacity to act anyway, consistently, until the action itself, not the fleeting feeling that started it, becomes who you are. The next time you catch yourself waiting to feel motivated before starting something that matters, remember this: motivation was never the requirement. It was only ever the excuse. If this resonated with you, you're not alone. So many people have spent years blaming themselves for a lack of motivation that was never actually the missing ingredient in the first place. If you're new here, this channel is called Withinism. We talk about things like this every week. The discipline nobody teaches clearly, and the honest, practical work of building a life that doesn't depend on how you feel on any given day. If this video helped you, subscribe, not for me, for the version of you that's tired of waiting to feel ready and finally ready to build something that doesn't depend on it. And if someone comes to mind who's been stuck waiting for motivation to return, send this to them. Sometimes the most useful thing you can offer someone is permission to stop waiting entirely. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.